It's only like a 7-hour drive.
Okay, I think we are finally recording. So, real quick, a note on the AccuPlacer. Okay, a note on the AccuPlacer. Mr. Lippy went down and talked to the guidance counselors, and it was determined that they are going to now add a March date here at Lake. I don't know that they have determined what that March date is, but they have added a March date to our AccuPlacer dates. So if you have gotten closed out of that and you want to take that here at Lake, you can go down and talk to Mrs. Gardner and she will get you on the list to do that because it's not on the dates. Last I checked, it wasn't on the dates when you go to the website to try to sign up. So talk to Mrs. Gardner, get on her list. Okay? Or you can go to Stark State and take it there. Penn State, Stark Campus. All right, guys. Like I told you yesterday. Okay, there are 4 things that you had to do. Find f plus g of x, find f minus g of x, then evaluate both of them for the given variable. So here were the different values that they had wanted you to substitute back in. So each of these had how many answers? 4. Okay. So how were the adding and the subtracting? Which one did you guys say was incorrect? Any of the first
5?
Okay, so not the first 4. So do we have any questions on 1 through 4? Now, how about domains and range? Domains, excuse me. Are you guys doing okay with domains on adding and subtracting? No. Okay. So let's look at f. What's the domain of f? If you have a 4th root, what's the domain? X has to be greater than or equal to 0. How about here? What's the domain? Greater than or equal to 0. Now, in both cases, when you added or subtracted, you got 14, 4th root of x, or negative 24, 4th root of x. Both of those, what's the domain? X is greater than or equal to 0. Because you cannot take the 4th root of a negative number, an even root of a negative number. So what's the domain in all of this? Greater than or equal to 0. Okay, let's go to number 2. What's the domain on f of x? All real number. It's cube root. Excuse me. You can take the cube root of any number. All real numbers. What's the domain on this cube root? All real numbers. Now, when you added and subtracted in both cases, you were left with negative 10 cube root of 2x or 12 cube root of 2x. In both cases, those are all real numbers. So what's the domain of both the sum and the difference? All right. Remember, you're looking for the most restrictive. They're all the same, so it's just whatever it was. Okay, let's go to number 3. What is the domain of this function? Well, this function is a cubic function. If you put it in standard form, your biggest degree is 3. What's the domain of a cube function? All real numbers. Okay. This function is quadratic. What's the domain of a parabola? All real numbers. When you added them, you got a cubic. And when you subtracted them, you got a cubic. So in both of those, what's your domain? So you have all real numbers, all real numbers, all real numbers. So what's your most restricted domain? All real numbers. Okay? Let's go down here. What's your domain of this guy? Well, it's a U. So what's your domain? All real numbers. What's your domain here? Okay? When you add and subtract them, you get a cubic. Not cubic, quadratic. So if it's a parabola, what's your domain? All real. So all real numbers, all real numbers, all real numbers. All right. We'll get to that. It's that dividing that give us issues. All right. Does anybody need any help adding or subtracting or evaluating 1 through 4? Okay. Number 5. Oh, it does say negative 27. Snap. Okay. We'll come back to that in a minute. This is like my 4th year teaching this, and no one's ever commented on this. Makes me mad. Okay, I'll adjust that. I wonder if my textbook says that. Sometimes the textbook says one thing and the online book says another. I'm just curious what my actual physical textbook says. Did you guys use your online book or the physical book? Online.
I got 118,000.
So this is number. Oh, it does say negative 27. Gosh darn it. Okay, I'll have to fix all those. Okay, so on number 5, what is the domain of that? All real numbers. What's the domain of this? All real numbers. So when you multiplied them, okay, when you multiplied, you were left with 2x to the 10 thirds. Does anybody need help getting to that? What's the domain of that? All real numbers, because it's cube root, right? Cube root of x to the 10th. All real numbers. So we have all real numbers, all real numbers. So the multiplication is what? All real numbers. Now, how about the division? When you divided, you had to be careful. Back at the beginning, you divided 2x to the third by the cube root of x. What is the denominator of a fraction not allowed to be? 0. So what is this denominator? We have to say, okay, no, wait a minute. We know it's all real numbers, but the denominator is not allowed to be 0. Then you simplified it, and you got 2x to the 8 thirds. But you had all real numbers, not equal to 0. So what's your domain? X can't be. It's everything except 0. Now, when you plug in a negative, I think the only thing, they're both just going to be negative, right? Is that how it changed on those? On my answer key, I had positive. When you plug in negative 27, doesn't it just make it?
I still got positive.
Yeah, that would be true, because when you raise it to the 10th power, it should be yeah, that's still right. I just put positive 27 in there, but when you do it and you raise it to the 10th, you still get a positive, and you raise it. Yeah. So it'd be negative 3 to the 10th and negative 3 to the 8th, but those would still be positive. So the answer should be correct. It's just in my work, I should have a little negative in there. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Number 6. What's the domain here? All real. What's the domain here? X has to be what? So right now, what's the most restricted domain? X has to be greater than or equal to 0. When you multiplied, you got 3x to the 9/2. Well, once again, it's a square root. So what are you going to tell me about your domain? It has to be what? Greater than or equal to 0, because square root. When you divided this one, you started with x to the 4th over 3x. Now, I put to the 1/2 because it was square root, and I said, all right, that's to the 1/2 because I'm going to have to subtract those exponents. Again, what is x not allowed to be? 0. So x is all real numbers that are greater than or equal to 0 that are not 0. So what's your domain? Everything greater than 0. Again, all real numbers that are greater than or equal to 0 that are not 0. Greater than 0. And then simplify. Are we okay there? All right. Which other domain do you guys need me to talk about? Are there any in particular that were hard? I talked about 2 of them. Do you guys want me to talk about 7, 8, or 9 domain? Or all of them?
No.
Are you feeling better about them?
No.
Or not? All right. We are going to work with this a little more today with domains. This is not going away. All right. Pass those in. Is it cold here? I don't think it. I think it's just comfy. I'm nice and comfy. Equivalent. All righty. So yesterday we talked about adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. There is one more operation we can do with functions, and this is called composition of functions. Okay, composition of functions. And I think this is way more confusing than it needs to be. Okay? This right here, whoops, I don't like that highlighter. This right here says, the way you read this, h of x is equal to g of f of x. G of f of x. Okay? And you always start with your inside and work out. Start with your inside and work out. We'll talk about domains in a minute when that becomes relevant. Let's look at our first one. Let f of x be the square root of 2x plus 1 and g of x be x squared minus 4. Find the indicated value. So we're going to read this g of f of 4. Again, that's g of f of 4. I'm going to start on the very, you're going to start on the very, very inside first. And what's the very, very inside say? F of 4. Okay. If I asked you to find f of 4, what would you guys do? Go to function f and plug in 4. Okay, so let's do that. Go to function f and plug in 4. So 2 times 4 plus 1. What's 2 times 4?
8,
Plus 1? 9. And what's the square root of 9?
3.
Okay, is everybody good there?
Yeah.
Well, we wanted g of f of 4. But what was f of 4? So we really want g of what? You guys see, you found f of 4. What's the value of f of 4? 3. So what do you do with the 3? Go to function g and plug in.
3.
So now you go here and say, okay, 3 squared minus 4. What's 3 squared? 9. And what's 9 minus 4? 5. So we could say g of f of 4 equals 5. Now, I like compositions. I think they're easy. What do you guys think of this first one? Good? All right, let's do another one. Now, we're using these same functions that are up there. So f of x is square root of 2x plus 1. G of x is x squared minus 4. What does it want you guys to find first? G of what? 2. So you go to function g, which was x squared minus 4. And what are you going to plug in for x? So you're going to plug in 2 squared minus 4. Well, what's 2 squared? And what's 4 minus 4? 0. So g of 2 equals 0. Okay, so now you're going to go to function what? F and plug in 0. Because g of 2 is 0. So you go to f, which is the square root of 2x plus 1. So square root of 2 times 0 plus 1. And as AJ told us, 2 times 0 is 0. 0. Plus 1 is? And the square root of 1 is 1. So f of g of 2 is 1. Okay, we're not doing the next one. Questions here. That's why you don't look ahead of me. All right, questions on that one. Actually, we are doing the next one. I lied. Sorry, Ty. All right, it's the next example that we're skipping some. All right, first it wants us to find g of what? -2. So you go to function g, which is x squared minus 4. So we're going to do negative 2 squared minus 4. What's negative 2 times negative 2? 4. And what's 4 minus 4? 0. So now which one do we go into again? Now we find g of 0. So we do it again. And we do 0 squared minus 4. Well, what's 0 squared? Minus 4. So g of negative 2 is negative 4. Questions there? Olivia, are you just coming back to school?
Yeah.
Okay, so you came through the attendance office. All right, let's try another one. F of x equals x minus 2, g of x equals x squared, and h of x equals x plus 5 over 2. So they gave you 3 different functions, but they only want you to find f of g of negative 1. So let's first find g of negative 1. So what are you guys going to do? Go into g and plug in what? Negative 1. In parentheses squared. What's negative 1 squared? 1. And now you're going to find f of 1. Because we want f of g of negative 1, which is 1. And you're just going to do 1 minus 2. And what's 1 minus 2? Negative 1. So f of g of negative 1 is negative 1. Thoughts on that one? Okay, last one, again with those same functions. G of h of negative 7. So now where do we start? H of negative 7. So h was x plus 5 over 2. So x plus 5 over 2. What's negative 7 plus 5? Negative 2. What's negative 2 over 2? Negative 1. Now we plug negative 1 back into which function? G. So we do g of negative 1. And g was just x squared. So it's just negative 1 squared. And what's negative 1 squared? 1. Okay. So this one says g of h of negative 7 is 1. Questions? All right, we are not doing B and C on this one, or C and D on this one. Now we're going to switch gears. This is where, okay, when you look at your domain, I'm going to put a note over here. For the domain, you need to look at the domain of the input and final answer. Okay, look at the domain of the input and the final answer. So on this one, we have f of g of x. Which one do you think is the input? G, right? G of x, because it's f of g of x. So this function here, this is your input. So let's come off to the side and let's say, okay, what's the domain of g of x? All right, look at g of x. What kind of a function is it? Linear. What's the domain of a linear function? All real numbers. Okay, so keep that in the back pocket. Now, we're going to do f of g of x. Okay, we don't have a number now. It just says f of g of x. Well, what is g of x? F of, what's g of x? 3x minus 3. So now we're going to go to function f. Now, if I had f of 5, what would you guys do? Everywhere you see an x, you'd plug in 5. Okay, but we don't have f of 5. We have f of what? No, we have f of what? We have f of So that goes in place of what?
X.
Okay, so watch. We're going to say, when we plug that in, we get 5. Anytime you replace x, you use parentheses. You guys know that. All of the -1. So all I did is I replaced that x, 5 times x to the -1, with 5 times g of x to the -1. Okay, we'll simplify in a minute. Are you guys okay with at least how you plug that in? All right, now, anytime you have anything raised to the negative power, where does this go? To the bottom. Now, the 5 is okay where it is. What's going to drop to the bottom? Can I simplify this any more?
No.
No. So this is f of g of x. Now, domain. We said we had to think about the domain. We already said the domain of our input was all real numbers. And the final answer. Those are the two things we have to input, final answer. What's the domain of this? Well, remember, we have a fraction. Anytime you have a fraction, the denominator is not allowed to be. What makes this denominator 0? Well, yeah, if you don't know, come off to the side and set it equal to 0. And say, okay, I would add 3, and then I would divide by 3, and I'd get x equals what? You're the best. Thank you. X equals what? 1. So that means my domain is what? So that means x is not allowed to be 1. So I have all real numbers except 1. So what's your domain? X cannot equal 1. Okay. Now that was f of g of x. Now we're going to find g of f of x. Okay. What was f of x? 5x to the what? Now remember, we got to think about the domain of my input. What's the domain of my input? Think about the g domain. Well, 5x to the -1 is 5 over what? What's the domain? X can't be 0. So x cannot be 0. So far, what's my restricted domain? Can't be 0.
Is that the domain of G or F?
It's the domain of f because it's the domain of your input. So you're always, Josh, going to look at your input, which is right there. Okay. Now we go to function g. I'm going to rewrite g up here because it's all the way up top. G of x is 3x minus 3. And now, what are you guys going to put in place here? So, how would I write this? Well, I have 3 times 5x to the -1 minus 3. Well, I am allowed to multiply these. If I had something out here, then I'd have to deal with that first, but I don't have anything out there, so I am allowed to just multiply. What's 3 times 5? And where does x to the -1 go? To the bottom. So this is g of f of x. What's the domain of this function? You got a fraction. X can't be 0. So we got x can't be 0. X can't be 0. So what's your domain? X can't be 0. Most restricted. Well, they're the same. The same. Okay. Try another one. F of g of x. Okay. What's g of x? 4x minus what? 3. Now, remember, you want to first find the domain of your input. So what's g of x domain? Yeah, it's linear. It's what? So far, do we need to worry about anything on our domain? So you do the input and the final answer. Now we're going to go to F. And everywhere I see a X, I'm going to plug in what? 4x minus 3. So when I do, I get 2 times 4x minus 3 all to the what? Negative 1. Are you guys okay with how I wrote that? Now, how do I simplify this? Okay, well, remember there is a multiplication sign there. Is the 2 happy where it is? It's got a positive exponent. It's fine. Is this quantity happy where it is? Where does it go? Now, be careful. What is X not allowed to be? What's not allowed to be 0? So 4x minus 3 is not allowed to be 0. So what are you going to do? Add 3. Divide by what? So what is x not allowed to be? X is not allowed to be 3/4. It was all real numbers except 3/4. Instead of B, I'm going to change B. Is everybody okay with A? Okay, I want to change B to G of X. Okay, what's G of X? So we have G of, and then G of X was 4x minus 3. So remember, you got to do your input. What's the domain of your input? It's linear. It's all real numbers. Now, you go back to G of X, which was 4x minus 3. And everywhere I see O what? What do you plug in? So I get 4 times what? Minus distribute. And then what do you get? 16x minus 15. And that's G of X. What's the domain? Okay, we said the input was all real numbers. What's the final answer? So what's your domain? How are you guys feeling about the domain? Are we getting better with domains? Okay. You guys came in asking me if this was easier or harder than last night. Easier? Way easier. Okay. Homework. 2 through 8 even, 12, 16, 18, and 19.